In the minds of children everywhere, the world is full of magic. Fictional wizards from Merlin to the Wizard of Oz have long amazed us. Now Harry Potter has captured the imagination of a new generation. In myths and stories, wizards are mysterious, heroic wise men who wear long cloaks, pointed hats, and have magical powers. They carry wands with which they command the natural world. They can transform themselves into animals. And they use secret spells and potions to heal or curse. But where do we get these ideas? Is the magic of those fictional wizards based on fantasy or fact? Far from being a modern invention, the idea of wizards and wizardry has its roots in beliefs dating back thousands of years. This is the story of where real wizards come from, and the facts behind the spells and rituals they practiced. This is the amazing story of real magic. The search for the people we now call wizards begins in the snow and woods of ancient Europe. It was a time when magical belief was the science of its age. A way of understanding the universe and surviving in the natural world. Europe was then a very, very different place, covered in thick forest.
The forest was a place of fear and fascination because it represented the unknown. This was, in a way, the realm of the other world as well. Filled, of course, with wild animals, many of them ferocious, particularly boars. There were deer, bears, badgers, wolves, all these creatures with which men communed very closely and didn't feel, I'm sure, the same distinction between animals and humans that we make. And animals are often depicted in very early literatures, of course, as speaking with humans and humans with them. The other world wasn't something which was like we think of heaven as existing on a different plane altogether. The other world was somewhere different, but it could also be right next to you. And the forest, with its darkness and its shadowy spirits and so forth, was one of the most obvious locations of the other world.
Nature was all that ancient man knew. In Britain, where many of our ideas about fictional wizards come from, people's beliefs were based around the natural world and the idea that the animals inhabiting it had spirits. People also relied on animals caught in the forest for food. If some humans could transform themselves into animals to aid the hunt, could this be some of the first evidence of what we now call wizardly magic?
About 9,000 years ago in Britain, somebody took a deer skull and punched holes in it to turn it into a mask. This means that somebody was able to put it on their face and transform themselves into a deer. The business of hunting is so difficult and uncertain, and it's so essential to catch meat, that we can imagine that this was something that needed special ritual to help to make it work. We can't know who did it or why. Maybe the person was a shaman or a magician or a wizard. Maybe it was part of hunting ritual, trying to encourage the souls of animals to come to him, maybe by entering the psychology of a deer. Maybe it was the start of what we now call theatre, part of some fertility drama to persuade the deer to multiply. But I think the point is that it enabled a human being to appear to transform themselves into a deer.
These magical transformations weren't just happening in ancient Britain. They were taking place all over the world. The best evidence for this has come from the wilderness of Siberia, Russia, one of the few places where ancient graves have been preserved. Over the last 35 years, Sergei Arutyanov has excavated more than 300 Inuit burials, some surviving deep in the permafrost for over 2,000 years.
The excavations landed extremely rich material and shed new light on the mythology of these people some 2 millennia ago. Animals in general play an enormous part. The transformation of animals, the reincarnation of animals, the connections between the human world and animal world. And many images of animals are found in our excavations. The Eskimo believes in the unity of the human world and the animal world. It is a single world where one kinds of animals can transform themselves into other kinds. So a polar bear can become a human being, and a human being can become temporarily a polar bear if he is a strong shaman.
It could be that the shaman is at the very heart of our exploration of what we now think of as a wizard. And there are some shamans still practicing today. Shot during the last 20 years, this rare film documents the life of a modern Siberian shaman.
A shaman's job is to serve a community, to take hunting. It's very important to understand the psychology of animals, to be able to persuade them to give themselves to you, to be able to outwit them perhaps if they don't, to know where they are. And one way of getting this special knowledge is actually to turn into these animals, much like wizards and magicians in other traditions. And that comes through the state of trance. Shamans reach that state most especially by drumming and other forms of rhythmical activity. But they may be other things. They may dance, they may fast or take psychotropic drugs. And all of these things are said not to distort your vision, but in fact to enhance it and to make it clearer and more real. This headdress covers her eyes, and it represents that she is seeing with a second sight into another world, into the world of ultimate reality. They believe that the cosmos has layers. They believe that the shaman is traveling from one layer to another. It's very difficult to control the shaman in that state. So the assistants have to hold on to her to prevent her from flying off into a kind of spiritual hyperspace and being unable to get back again. You could say it resembles our idea of magic, in the sense that there's a very direct connection between your intention and what you do about it. You want something to happen, and so you do a spell, you do an action, you do a ritual, you do a prayer, and you hope that that will make the desired outcome happen. You want animals to give themselves to the hunter. You go and talk to the animal spirits, then animals come to the hunter. The shaman is somebody who has this additional knowledge, which everybody else needs to draw on.
Ancient peoples sent their shamans to their graves with enormous ceremony and reverence. The most spectacular evidence of this burial ritual is in Dr. Rutionov's excavation of a shaman's burial site in 1967.
From the very beginning, it was obvious that it was a very unusual burial. It was obvious that somebody or something very precious should have been hidden in this excavation that needed to be preserved so thoroughly. From the top, it was covered by huge wooden slabs.
The skeleton was crushed so badly under the weight of the slabs that the team couldn't tell whether it was male or female. As they carried on digging, they stumbled across a terrifying symbol of the shaman's power.
We suddenly saw under it, quite clearly, somewhere between the knees of the skeleton, a mask with a frightening grin. And our Eskimo friends, when they saw it, jumped back, and said, "Don't touch it, it's death." At that moment, Dorian Sergeyev descended into the grave and put his hands on the mask and told us, "I have taken this power on myself. Perhaps other people can also touch this mask." But they didn't touch it.
Archaeology has proven that these shamans, these ancient wizards, really did exist. It also provides evidence for the real origins of that favorite instrument of a mythical wizard's magic: the wand.
This is probably the oldest sacred site in the entire British Isles, used constantly from about 30,000 years ago to about 20,000 years ago. That's before the last ice age, and could be the site of the first human burial ever known in the British Isles.
What's really unusual about the cave is the ivory wands that seem to have been made there or broken there. We're talking here about the time when human beings first become human, the very, very first time when they have ceremonial burials. They bury people properly with goods. They make art. They seem to be able to think religiously, spiritually. This person was a sorcerer, somebody so powerful, a wizard of his time, that he was put in the greatest ceremonial place of the entire landmass. And they broke the ivory wands, the sign of spiritual power, and put them in with him, and dyed the whole place blood red to give him a good rebirth in the afterlife, and left him.
What function might the wand have had in aiding a powerful wizard?
The wizard's wand is his most potent tool. Everybody knows how it feels when you eyeball somebody, you point at them. Wants you. Yes, you! With a wand, you extend that. It's a much, much more powerful finger or arm with a mind stuck in it. It's an object which, rather like a lightsaber or a ray gun, projects the human will directly.
If the first clues to the origins of wizardry are found with the ancient shamans, the next evidence comes with the real-life inspiration for that most well-known of mythical wizards, Merlin. One of the very first fictional wizards is Merlin. He's most popularly known as King Arthur's spiritual advisor. But as more and more scholars have come to examine the myth of Merlin, other views have emerged.
Merlin's story is a transformation from being a military nutter to being an all-purpose wizard. He's originally a warrior who goes mad because he abandons his lords and leaves them to die, and then goes mad with guilt. Wanders in a forest, gradually gets his sanity back with a gift of prophecy. And after a few hundred years, you reach the 12th century, and he's turned into somebody who's the son of a mortal mother and a demon father, so he has demonic powers in him to work with spirits and to achieve magic. He's actually bigger and stronger physically than most men. And we roll on another couple of hundred years, and he's become the ultimate wizard, the person with the great books of spells who understands how the world works, who knows how the future's going to be.
For one man, tracking down the truth behind the wizard Merlin has been a life's quest.
I believe there's some very strong arguments to support the idea that there was a real Merlin, that he lived up in the north near Carlisle, on the banks of the Solway, which was a very wild region indeed in those days. It's my belief that Merlin was almost certainly a druid.
Around 2,500 years ago, the Druids began to adopt the shamanic beliefs prevalent in Europe and turned them into an organized religion complete with set rituals, high priests and mass following. The Merlin of myth seems to have inherited all of these traditions.
The early legend describes him as acting in an extraordinarily shamanistic way. He is accompanied by his familiar animals, a wolf and a boar. He lives out in the wilds and the forest. He even appears to fly. He runs with the deer. There's one very peculiar reference which suggests that he himself may have worn an antlered helm.
Legend aside, as a druid, Merlin would have been part of a sophisticated magical network that spanned Europe.
The Druids are the people who are expert in magic and religion in northwestern Europe about 2,000 years ago. And they were very big in what's now the British Isles, France, and the Netherlands. They impressed the heck out of the Greeks and Romans as people of great power and wisdom. Unfortunately, they impressed the heck out of them in different ways. Some Greek and Roman writers said they were incredibly wise and gentle, deeply in touch with nature and the human soul. And others said they were bloodthirsty barbarians, dyed up to the elbows in human blood, and experts in sacrifice and all manners of savage and horrible religious rites.
I think Druids are very influential in terms of putting forward an image of the wizard, the wise man, the wise woman, the seer, and so on. People who understood the universe, natural scientists, and most important, they were in charge of all sacrifices, public and private, including human, and they were in charge of all religious matters. So they were very, very powerful.
The Druids had magical objects, secretive rituals, and all manner of apparently wizardly powers, including the ability to divine the future, one of the key attributes of the fictional wizard. The most conclusive evidence that the Druids practiced divination is found at a unique site, the Stanway Quarry in Essex, England.
This site of Stanway was excavated between about 1987 and 1997 intermittently, and it's so important because it's the only grave we have in Britain of a doctor or ritual specialist.
In the grave, archaeologists discovered coins, knives, and an unusual gaming board. They also discovered something that suggests that part of this doctor's practice was to predict the future for his patients.
These artefacts that are found in the grave have been called divination rods. These are the only examples we have in Britain. It's been suggested perhaps they were used for cauterizing wounds, but they're very unusual. We have 4 made of iron and we have 4 made of copper alloy. And amongst those, we have 2 small and 2 big of each sort.
Basically, what's happening with divination is that you are trying to foretell the future, and you're doing that by, again, tapping into the spirit world. That means that you're trying, in a sense, to ask the supernatural world when the best time or the bad time for doing certain things is.
So you could ask questions like, is my sick daughter going to die? Should I take her to the doctor? Is today a good day to perform a healing ritual? These sorts of yes-no questions.
How a druid doctor may have interpreted the tools of his trade remains a mystery.
Of course, we've got no idea how to read these. We don't know what they mean. They could mean something, they could point in a certain direction. They might say, there's a witch living in the village in this direction, and she's the one who made you ill. They might perhaps say precisely what's wrong with you.
Even in the grave, the rods appeared to be imbued with symbolism.
They were placed in a very particular way upon the board. There was an iron rod placed across the board like this, and just behind it was a small iron and a small copper alloy rod, and the rest were placed in a bundle over here. And it might be that this particular arrangement had a particular reading. Perhaps, I mean, it might symbolize death, but I think what we can say is that the way everything was placed out upon this board was very significant. The gods themselves were seen to be powerful because the spirits could influence the way the gods fell, and it's probably due to the magical powers of these gods that they were actually placed in the grave. And in this way they wouldn't have been inherited by anyone else. They were so magical, so powerful, they couldn't have been touched by anybody else. They had to be buried along with the person who owned them.
Divination is power. If you've got that kind of knowledge, then you're a very powerful being. Those who could do it, those in the know, were tremendously powerful because they were the people on whom the whole of society depended for the best time to sow crops, to reap crops, to go into battle, for a royal marriage or something. All of these things would be in the hands of a few individuals who were able to divine.
Not all Druid ceremonies served such a benign and practical purpose. Some of the most revered Druid wizards were themselves subjected to the most gruesome of rituals. Dark and mysterious Druid rituals continue to be practiced across Northern Europe for hundreds of years. The most amazing evidence for these beliefs is found on an artifact that is familiar to every fictional wizard. A cauldron. The Gundestrup cauldron, a huge silver bowl, was found in a bog in Denmark, where it had been left 2,100 years earlier.
The Gundestrup cauldron is completely and utterly unique. It's made up of 13 inner and outer plates, and they seem to represent a kind of mythical journey or story, because each of the plates is carved with engraved and punched drawings of what appear to be supernatural scenes.
Well, this cauldron shows several interesting scenes. On the outside are several gods and goddesses. But the most interesting part is the inner side. One of the scenes shows a group of people, some walking on foot, some of them with war trumpets, others on horseback. And this row is moving towards a very tall figure. And this tall figure holds a smaller figure upside down above a kind of cauldron.
It's full of fantastic, supernatural, half-human, half-beast. It has an antlered god, it has a ram-horned snake, it has people wearing necklets or torques, it shows figures of animal sacrifice, it shows figures of people flying or swimming to the other world. I regard it, perhaps irreverently, as a huge psychedelic trip. It looks to me like one huge vision or dream inspired by a seer or a shaman's experience. If you can imagine sitting in a house, perhaps with the only light coming through from the roof or from an unglazed window, people sitting all around it, with it glowing perhaps in the firelight, with all the figures, in a sense, dancing in the light. It would be shimmering, it would be filled with red wine, with blood or something like that. And the whole thing would be an intense visual experience. It would be bubbling away, perhaps speaking to the druid, to the shaman. You can imagine how it takes on a life of its own, and it becomes, in a sense, a sacred being itself.
The cauldron was so sacred that it was disposed of with great ceremony.
It was kept for several centuries or decades, dismantled first and then placed very reverently on a little dry island, cast as a votive offering in the middle of a marsh.
The watery marshes and bogs that span much of northern Europe 2,000 years ago were regarded as holy sites by the Druids, portals into the other world, the spirit world.
The Druids had a belief that the other world was very similar to this world, but a mirror image of it, and better. And in a way, water encapsulated that. By looking into water, you can see reflected the sky, the stars, trees, and so on. And you can perceive that as being that other world. They seem to have been special places, repositories for people wanting to offer things to the gods, either to ask them for something or to thank them for something.
I think we're very lucky that people in the distant past brought all those objects to the bogs. Because of the good preservative qualities of the bogs, all kind of perishable materials have survived up to our time. So this gives us a wonderful window to the past.
During the Iron Age, at least, most people, we think, were cremated, and there's no record left of most people. But certain members of society seem to have been specially chosen for particular burial, intact, in marshes.
One such burial in a Danish bog was the beautifully preserved Tollen Man. Found 50 years ago in a peat cutting, Tollen Man is over 2,000 years old and gives a rare insight into the life of a druid.
People like Tollen Man were revered. They were special, they were seers, they were wise men. If you like, they were the nearest we're going to get to ancient wizards.
Well, he's a man in his 40s or 50s. He has a beard stubble. I suppose he was rather clean-shaven when he died. I mean, the skin shrinks a bit after that, so the beard stubbles come out. You can see his hands, and they are almost only bones. But some of the bog bodies have manicured nails, and this has led some to think that these were not ordinary farmers, but members of the elite who didn't have to do manual labor. There's some pieces of clothing with him, his cap, his fur cap, and his belt. And we don't know whether he was put in his grave, so to speak, with only this, or whether he had some other garments which decayed.
We've got the archaeological evidence that people wore trousers, jerkins of leather, but often a long leather or hide cloak. And so there's this, you can imagine how the idea of the wizard perhaps grew from that. Not only that, but we've actually got some evidence from bog bodies like Tollen Man, for instance, that pointed hats were worn, because Tolland was wearing a birch bark helmet, which seems to have been a rather sort of pointed shape. It's quite possible that people thinking about imaging wizards would have gone back to antiquity to see what sort of things were being worn. He had eaten a ritual meal of a kind of absolutely filthy gruel. It was absolutely disgusting. It was a kind of mixture of cereals and berries and all sort of mushed up into a sort of thin porridge. Very, very unappetizing, but clearly of some kind of symbolic significance. Again, a number of different wild and cultivated cereals and seeds, and most importantly of all, a large quantity of ergot. Ergot is something that you get on rotting rye, and it's a highly toxic substance which is highly visible on the plant, but causes violent hallucinations, terrific sensations of burning, cramps, agony, lifelessness in the fingers and toes, and in the early stages at least would cause a tremendous contortion of movement, a sort of dancing, ceremonial, weaving movement of agony. And the idea that Tollen Man would behave like that, he would be regarded as being possessed by the spirits. Whether or not he'd ingested the substance deliberately or accidentally, he would have behaved like something possessed by devils or possessed by the spirits. One of the things which characterised a lot of the bog bodies is the overkill violence. They were either garroted using a special rope with a particular knot at the back of the neck, or their throats were cut, or they were killed in other very violent ways. The interesting thing about Tollen Man was that somebody had gone in and, in a sense, laid him out. They didn't just leave him in the position that he was, in the sort of contorted attitude that he would have been in when he died. Somebody went into the bog after him, arranged him in a sleeping position on his side, closed his eyes.
Tollen Man has a very tranquil expression on his face. He's lying in a sleeping position. This indicates that he wasn't just thrown in an old peat cutting, but he was deposited there very carefully. So I think reason enough to exclude just another murder case.
If Tollen Man was, in fact, an ancient wizard, who killed him and why?
There is some evidence to suggest that some people volunteered themselves for sacrifice, people who wanted to remain within their communities and be able, still after death, to advise people to maintain that link with the spirit world. Maybe Tollen Man actually volunteered himself to stay with his people and act as a link between the ancestors and the earthly world after he died.
In that earthly world, wizards were about to face a challenge to their authority. Christianity. After thousands of years of dominance across Europe, the secret knowledge of the shamans and druids, the ancient wizards, was forced underground by the powerful new magic of Christianity.
With the Middle Ages, you have a three-way split. You have the official magic of the church, worked by a priest or a saint or a mystic, often with robes and staff in a magical manner, which heal and curse. You have the village magician still quietly working away with herbs and simples and spells. And you have this tradition of learned magic among professional sorcerers, really clever people with lots and lots of old books, who are kind of suspect and yet admired by the church for having perhaps some kind of arcane knowledge.
Wizards and witches were herbalists, doctors and healers who harnessed the power of plants for secret spells. The church was deeply fearful of the power of this message and created all manner of myth to discredit phenomena it couldn't understand. One such phenomenon was that wizards and witches believed that they could fly on broomsticks.
For a long time, people used to laugh at the idea that there could be such a thing as a flying ointment. Witches and wizards who were interested in mind-altering drugs found that actually using them by delivering them through the skin in ointments, they could actually slow down the uptake of these rather powerful substances and get the hallucinogenic effects without actually poisoning themselves. The witches and wizards would often lie by the side of a hot fire, and that would actually melt the ointment and therefore increase its effect. And they'd probably sweep up the embers of the fire, so they'd always be found with a broom lying next door to them.
So, yeah, and I liberated Brazil. I mean, Palenque. Oh, I know he has nukes. I'm not really prepared for something this. Because I have to, it's going to put me at war with him. I have to take all the cities. See, if I do it in an emergency, there's no warmonger penalty. Which means I get to just take his cities right now. But if I reject it, which I think I'm going to do, we can see what happens. I liberate it, even compliment it. Was my ally, maybe it shifted to, well, he wasn't at war with anyone. He just went out and he just conquered. Like, he thinks it's cool to just do that, to just go and take over a city-state. I worked hard on, I don't know. Do I want to conquer all of Brazil right now? I guess, maybe, I don't know. I kind of like having him in the game. I'm kind of enjoying the way things are, and the way that, I'm thinking, like, let's see what happens. See who jumps in on this, if anyone, and I don't know. I can liberate it in a snap if I make it. All them units. He has a huge army. I don't have, you know, I have cities on his main continent, and he can take them. Like I don't think I could stop him from taking them. Well, maybe I could. I mean, I don't know. It would be pretty hard, but he has a lot. It would be pretty hairy. I have to bring my forces to bear. I don't have a fuck ton of cash right now to be buying all kinds of units. Well, I have to use cash and pay. I can get some, but oh my god. I'm afraid that he will nuke me. I don't know how many nukes he has. You know, but is that what he's banking on? Like I say, if he nukes me, I have the capacity right now. I may not have the units set up in place to do a conventional warfare with him. Well, I mean, I could hold him off until I get reinforcements. Really, what I am set up though for is to nuke the shit out of him at a moment's notice. That I can do. I can do that anytime. I'm all set. I got everything in place to nuke everybody. I could nuke everybody right now. Just to end the world right now. Well, actually, I didn't set it up for Japan, really. Well, actually, yeah, well, you know what? I could nuke Japan. Anyway, yeah, everybody would be fucked. I'll have to start a whole other video just for this. Oh my god. You know what, I never really did like a serious nuclear war. Alright, let me start another stream.